Picture this, it's the year 1350, and you're a medieval peasant waking up to another grueling day. Your stomach's growling, but there's no fridge, no Uber Eats, no grocery store. What's for breakfast? It's not avocado toast. Today, we're diving into the real, gritty diet of a medieval peasant, what they ate, how they survived, and whether you could handle it. Stick around, because by the end, I'm going to challenge you to try a peasant meal yourself and tell me how it goes in the comments. Let's get into it. Before we dig into the food, let's set the scene. Medieval peasants weren't just eating to live, they were eating to survive. Life was brutal. You worked sun up to sundown, plowing fields, dodging famine, and praying the harvest didn't fail. Food wasn't a choice, it was whatever you could grow, find, or beg for. One bad frost, and your whole village could starve. Historical records show that during the Great Famine of 1315, up to 15% of Europe's population died from hunger. That's the stakes we're talking about. So, what fueled these tough-as-nails peasants through 12-hour workdays with no coffee breaks? Their diet was simple, cheap, and repetitive, but it worked. Let's break down a typical day, meal by meal, and trust me, it's going to make you rethink that "I'm starving" complaint when lunch is 10 minutes late. Before we dive in, hit pause. What's the weirdest thing you've eaten when you were desperate? Drop it in the comments, I'm dying to know. Morning in a peasant's hut was no Instagram-worthy brunch. You'd stumble out of bed, probably a pile of straw, and head to the fire where last night's pottage was still simmering. Pottage was the MVP of medieval meals, the ultimate use-what-you-got dish. Think of it as a soup that never quit, like a Netflix series renewed for 20 seasons. What was in it? Whatever was around. The base was usually cheap grains like barley, oats, or rye, boiled until mushy. Toss in some veggies, turnips, cabbage, maybe an onion if you were lucky. If the garden was looking sad, you might add wild nettles or dandelions. Archaeological digs from medieval villages show pottage pots were rarely cleaned, families just kept adding to them for weeks. One study found a pot with traces of 12 different ingredients layered over days. Talk about a flavor bomb. Peasants ate pottage for breakfast because it was warm, filling, and dirt cheap. A single pot could feed a family of 5 for days. On a good day, you might get a splash of flavor from wild herbs like parsley or sage. On a great day, a scrap of bacon fat to make your taste buds sing. But don't get too excited, meat was a rare guest, like a celebrity cameo. Some peasants believed pottage had magical powers. A 14th century record mentions a village healer who swore adding certain herbs to pottage could ward off evil spirits. Would you try that brew? Could you eat the same soup every morning for a month? Tell me in the comments, bonus points if you'd add bacon. By noon, you're sweating in the fields, and it's time for the main event, bread. Bread wasn't just food, it was life. Medieval peasants ate pounds of it daily, sometimes 2 or 3 pounds for a grown man. That's like eating a whole loaf of Wonder Bread by yourself, every single day. Why so much? It was the cheapest way to get the calories needed for backbreaking labor. But this wasn't your fluffy supermarket loaf. Peasant bread was dark, dense, and gritty, made from rye or barley because wheat was for fancy folks like lords and bishops. The grain was often low quality, mixed with fillers to stretch it further. Ground peas, beans, even acorns in tough times. One grim account from 1320 describes peasants mixing in tree bark during a famine. Chew on that for a second. Baking was a hassle. Most peasants didn't have ovens, so they used communal village ovens once a week. By day 7, that bread was rock hard, so you dunk it in pottage or ale to soften it up. Oh, and here's a wild one, rye bread could be dangerous. It was prone to ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations or worse. Entire villages sometimes tripped out on St. Anthony's fire without knowing why. Imagine biting into your sandwich and suddenly seeing dragons. I want to know, would you rather eat week-old, rock-hard bread or risk the hallucination loaf? Drop your pick in the comments. By evening, you're beat, and it's time for dinner if you're lucky enough to get a second meal. Most days, it's back to the pottage pot or, if things are tight, a bowl of gruel. Gruel was like Pottage's sad cousin, watery, bland, and barely food. You'd boil a handful of oats or barley scraps in a ton of water, maybe add a pinch of salt if you had it. It filled your belly, but it wasn't winning any Michelin stars. Medieval records show monasteries serving gruel to the poor during famines, stretching 1 cup of grain to feed 10 people. That's 2 tablespoons each. Good luck feeling full, but sometimes dinner got exciting. If you grew peas or beans, you might mash them into a protein-packed paste. Dried peas were 25% protein, making them a peasant's secret weapon. A small garden patch could yield 60 pounds of dried legumes, enough to last months. Boiled, mashed, maybe flavored with wild garlic, suddenly, you're eating like a slightly less poor peasant. If the stars aligned, the hunt went well, or you scored scraps from the Lord's butcher, you might get meat. Not a juicy steak, mind you. Peasants got the lawful bits, organs, feet, heads. A pig's head was a jackpot. You'd fry the cheeks, jelly the snout, even scramble the brains. Waste nothing, right? One village record from 1290 mentions a family eating badger during a lean winter. Badger. Could you stomach that? Here's your first challenge, try making gruel at home. Just oats, water, and a pinch of salt. Film it, taste it, and tell me in the comments if you'd survive a week of it. Tag me so I can see your reactions. Snacking wasn't really a thing, but peasants grabbed what they could between meals. A chunk of bread, a raw turnip, maybe some wild berries in summer. Kids were sent to forage for blackberries or raspberries, which were like candy, sweet, free, and gone far since they didn't preserve well without sugar. Drinks? Forget water. Medieval water was often a health hazard, contaminated by sewage or worse. Instead, everyone drank ale, kids included. Small ale was weak, about 1 to 3% alcohol, like a fizzy kombucha. It was safer than water because brewing boiled out the germs. Adults downed a gallon a day, more during harvest. Brewing was women's work, done weekly with malted barley and herbs for flavor. Leftover ale even went into bread dough, tying the whole diet together. For special days, weddings, harvests, you might get cider or mead. Cider came from apples, which grew on land too hilly for crops. Mead, made from honey, was rare because honey was precious. A single beehive could yield 20 pounds of honey a year, enough for a few gallons of mead and some sweet treats. One peasant reportedly said he'd eat honey till my belly ached if he were king for a day. Relatable. Ale for breakfast, yay or nay? And what's your go-to drink when water's not an option? Spill it in the comments. When crops failed, peasants turned to the forest like it was a grocery store with no checkout line. Spring meant young greens, dandelions, nettles, sorrel, packed with vitamins after a winter of bland food. Nettles stung like crazy, but boil them, and they're a superfood. Summer brought mushrooms, but you had to know your stuff, one wrong pick, and you're not waking up. A 1330s record tells of a family poisoned by bad mushrooms during a shortage. High risk, high reward. Fall was nut season. Chestnuts were gold, called the bread tree in France because they mimicked grain's starchy power. One tree could drop 200 pounds of nuts, enough to feed a family for weeks. Acorns were trickier, bitter tannins meant days of soaking, but they made famine bread when grain ran out. Court records from 1317 describe fights over acorn groves during the Great Famine. That's how serious it got. If you had to forage one food to survive, nuts, greens, or mushrooms, what's your pick, and why? Let's debate in the comments. Here's the real kicker, peasants weren't just eating to get by, they were inventing dishes we still love today. Italian polenta? Started as peasant grain mush. French ratatouille? I could clean out the garden stew. Even haggis came from using every scrap of a sheep. Hunger forced creativity, and that whatever we have mindset was genius. Tax records list peasants paying debts with odd combos, half a cabbage, 3 turnips, a handful of peas, because that's what they had. Sound familiar? It's like raiding your fridge for dinner. This adaptability was their superpower. No recipe books, no measuring cups, just instinct and necessity. A 14th century saying went, "Hunger is the best sauce." When you're starving, even ash cakes, bread cooked in fire ashes, taste like survival. During famines, peasants ground hay or dirt-swept granary dust for these gritty cakes. One account calls them the food that fights death. Dramatic, but true. Try a whatever we have's meal. Grab random stuff from your kitchen, make something edible, and share the results in the comments. Did it taste like a peasant feast or a total fail? So, could you hack a medieval peasant's diet? Let's recap a day: pottage for breakfast, bread and maybe beans for lunch, gruel or a lucky meat scrap for dinner, washed down with ale. Snacks are berries or a turnip if you're fancy. It's repetitive, it's bland, and it's barely enough to keep you going. But it worked. Peasants built castles, plowed fields, and raised families on this. Here's the big question: modern life is cushy compared to 1350, but are we tougher? Could you give up pizza, coffee, and Netflix for a week of pottage and hard bread? I'm not so sure. Their diet was a masterclass in resilience, making do with less, wasting nothing, and finding flavor where we'd see none. I dare you to live like a peasant for one day. Make pottage, grain, veggies, herbs, eat bread with no butter, skip water for tea or juice to mimic ale. Film it, post it, and tag me in the comments. I'll shout out the best ones in my next video. Alright, let's talk about the medieval peasant's version of dessert, because even in the grimmest times, people craved a little sweetness. Sugar? That was for kings and merchants with fat wallets. For peasants, sweetness came from two hard-won treasures, honey and wild berries. These weren't daily treats, they were like finding gold in a muddy field. Honey was the ultimate flex. Getting it meant battling bees with nothing but smoke and courage. Peasants would track wild hives in forests, risking stings to carve out gooey honeycomb. Some got smart and built beehives from straw or logs. One hive could churn out 15 pounds of honey a year, enough to sweeten a family's life for months. A 1370s village record lists a beehive as valuable as a cow in a widow's will. That's how big a deal it was. Honey didn't just sweeten pottage or bread, it was medicine, too, smeared on wounds or mixed with herbs for coughs. One medieval healer claimed honey could chase away winter gloom. Sounds like they knew about seasonal blues before it was a thing. Then there were berries, strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, free if you had time to pick them. Kids were the MVPs here, sent to scour hedges and woods for these juicy bursts of flavor. Problem was, berries didn't last. No jars, no freezers. You ate them fast or lost them. One monk's journal from 1295 describes a village feast where kids brought baskets of berries, and adults wept because it reminded them of better days. That's the power of a rare treat. Here's the kicker: honey and berries together? Pure luxury. A peasant might drizzle a drop of honey on berries for a sick kid or a wedding feast. It was their version of chocolate cake. Could you imagine waiting all year for that? What's your favorite sweet treat, and would you swap it for a handful of berries with honey? Tell me in the comments. Let's see who's got a peasant sweet tooth. Now, let's dive into the medieval equivalent of a drive-through, salted herring. When meat was off the table, and trust me, it was off a lot, thanks to church rules banning it on Fridays, Lent, and half the year, fish swooped in to save the day. Herring was the people's champ, cheap, plentiful, and ready to eat straight from the barrel. Why herring? They swam in massive schools, easy to net by the millions. Fishing logs from 1300s England show one fleet hauling in 50 million herring in a single season, enough to feed entire towns. Once caught, they were gutted, packed in salt, and sometimes smoked into red herring, which lasted months without spoiling. The smell? Let's just say herring districts in medieval ports were not the place for a romantic stroll. One town law banned processing fish upwind of the market because the stench drove customers away. For peasants, herring was a game changer. It was protein you didn't need to cook, perfect for a quick lunch in the fields. You'd pair it with bread or toss it into pottage for a fishy upgrade. During Lent, when meat was a sin, herring kept you alive. A Yorkshire monastery's records show they bought 20,000 herring a year for 50 monks. That's over a fish a day per person. And yeah, herring breath was a thing. One cheeky poem from the time jokes about a wife refusing to kiss her fisherman husband until he had left the sea behind. But herring wasn't boring. Clever cooks soaked it to cut the salt, then chopped it into spreads or baked it in pies. It was versatile, like the medieval version of canned tuna. Could you handle fish every day for weeks? I'm not sure I could. Try eating canned fish, sardines, tuna, whatever, for a meal and channel your inner peasant. How was it? Drop your verdict in the comments. I want to know if you'd survive Lent. The dark side, famine foods and desperate measures. We've talked about the good days, but what happened when the crops failed, the pottage pot ran dry, and even bread was a memory? Medieval peasants didn't just give up, they got creative, and sometimes, downright desperate. Welcome to the world of famine foods, where survival meant eating things that'd make your stomach turn. When grain vanished, peasants scoured the land for backups. Tree bark was a go-to, yep, actual bark, ground into a gritty flour for bread that was more splinters than sustenance. A 1316 famine report describes villagers mixing bark with clay to make it stretch further. Clay. Then there were weeds and roots, cattail roots, dug from swamps, could be boiled into a starchy mush. One grim account mentions peasants eating grass like cattle during the 1322 famine, with kids sent to graze fields for anything green. Animals weren't off limits either. In normal times, peasants trapped small game, squirrels, hedgehogs, but in desperation, they ate what we'd call pests. Rats, crows, even dogs in the worst years. A court record from 1317 fines a man for stealing his neighbor's cat, not as a pet, but as dinner. That's how bad it got. The saddest part? Even these foods weren't enough sometimes. Medieval coroners' rolls list kids and elders dying from belly swelling after eating indigestible plants. Yet, peasants kept fighting. They'd boil leather belts or shoes into a chewy soup or grind old bones for broth. One story tells of a woman who saved her kids by cooking her only plough robe. Talk about a last resort. This resilience blows my mind. It's a reminder of how far humans will go to survive. Makes you wonder what you'd eat if push came to shove. If you were starving, what's one thing you'd never eat, no matter what? Bugs, bark, or something else? Spill your limit in the comments, let's get real. That's the wild, weird, and honestly inspiring world of medieval peasant food. They survived on grit, ingenuity, and whatever the land gave them. Next time you're annoyed your takeout's late, think of the peasant dunking week-old bread in pottage and maybe cut them some slack. If you loved this deep dive, smash that like button. It tells YouTube to show this to more history nerds like us. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss my next video, where we're exploring T's next topic, e.g. how medieval peasants partied. Before you go, answer this in the comments. What's one peasant food you'd try, and what's one you'd skip? Pottage, gruel, or badger stew? Pick your poison. I'm reading every comment, so let's keep this feast going. See you next time.